Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR FM 89.
And hello again, everyone, and thanks very much for being with us. Political pros were a bit surprised a couple of weeks ago when voter turnout exceeded expectations. So what was behind that surge? Can it continue through the runoff primary and into November? And even if it does, can that offset what is typically a rather lower turnout than many other states record? And it is, of course, a midterm year. So to what extent is that a reflection of voter registration, in which Arkansas is near the bottom? We'll get to that in a moment. Up top, though, whether some current events in Washington can affect either registration or turnout or both. Hearings into the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol, televised in prime time by a select committee that none of our 4 congressmen voted to create. Can those meetings move the needle, either left or right? Well, joining us from the left, Democratic consultant Michael Cook, and from the right, GOP strategist Richard Bearden. Gentlemen, thanks very much for coming in. Michael, we'll start with you because the Democrats do control the House, therefore they control the committee. Your first thoughts on this first night of hearing?
It was a fascinating hearing in terms of all the facts that were laid out, in terms of telling the story. Not only happened what happened on January the 6th, but Liz Cheney, the Republican, one of the Republicans on the committee, her laying out that this was a coordinated plan. It wasn't just a one-day event where things got kind of out of hand, that there was a whole strategy from Donald Trump and his allies in the Republican Party to frankly throw a bloodless coup to, everybody around. I liked how they had the words of his Attorney General Bill Barr saying there was no fraud in the election. It was all basically fair and square. Everybody was telling President Trump it was a fair election, you lost, but he kept telling the lie because he refused to believe it and tried to take over the reins of government and completely subvert our democracy. So utterly fascinating hearing, and I look forward to what the other hearings holds.
Yeah. Richard Bearden.
Michael Cook, along with 10 other people, may be looking forward to a fascinating week of TV. I think it was interesting to watch. Is it going to move the needle in Arkansas one way or the other? I don't think so. I think the people that have already made their mind up about what happened was wrong, probably cemented their views a little deeper. For those that think somehow or another this election was skewed or stolen, nothing changed. Again, I think it's very much like the Watergate hearings. The hearings needed to be had. The facts need to be laid out. Was it made for primetime TV, exposure? I think that remains to be seen.
One of the national pundits, could have been me, put the question or posited, the people that the Democrats most want to watch these hearings probably aren't going to watch.
We focus so much on, the ratings. Is it going to move the needle in Arkansas? I think we lose sight of the bigger picture with these day-to-day back and forth of, the ratings good, is it new information? We came so close to losing our democracy, to having our government completely overthrown. And yeah, I agree, Richard, it won't move the needle in Arkansas one iota in any way. It won't affect the races for governor or the U.S. Senate. We all know how these are going to go. But I think we're losing sight of the bigger picture of how close we were. A few different things had changed. We would not have the democracy that we were supposed to have the first time. America has always prided itself on having a peaceful transfer of power. We certainly didn't have it this last time.
That would seem, though, gentlemen, to be a pretty hard sell in today's climate. That democracy was literally at stake. Richard Bearden?
Well, I agree.
First of all, do you concur with that? And
I do. I think it was a sort of a black eye on the process. Nixon resigned before he was impeached. But since that time, we've had 2 other impeachments of presidents. So now it's become, if you don't like the way the president's doing things, well, let's impeach him on this charge or that charge. So I do think that the political discourse probably sunk a little bit beneath the waves on January the 6th. I remember my business partner and I were sitting there watching as it unfurled, and it was sort of like, this is surreal. I think it was the Washington Post that did a lengthy expose. If you read that, as Michael alluded to, a lot of pre-planning went into this. I don't think it was just some rally where folks got a little amped up and broke into the Capitol. And I do think the American people need to read and understand and see what happened. I just don't know that last night, I mean, at one point the chairman, after the police officer's testimony, said, boy, that is fascinating to have heard. I mean, you know, they were reading the teleprompter. I just don't know at the end of the day that the average voter, mom and pop out there, watched that and went, good gravy, I've got to go learn more about what happened.
Yeah, there was immediate, even before the gavel came down, there was a counteroffensive by, let's call them Trump loyalists, who sought to delegitimize the proceedings. It does suffer, though, does it not? At least in public perceptions, Michael Cook, in that this committee was created with 0 Republican votes, well, 2 Republican votes, I think.
Well, first of all,
and none from Arkansas, by the way.
Right. You know, the fact that it is a bipartisan committee, there are Republican members on the committee,
both identified as rhinos.
But they're still members of the Republican Party. That's the, you know, whether Republicans like them or not, they were elected as Republicans. But also Republicans made a tactical mistake way back when on the national level, because they could have had more control or more say in the middle of it. We don't need to get to all the back behind the scenes stuff, but they made a mistake and didn't try to put more members on that committee. But at the end of the day, they're still telling the story of what happened on January the 6th and all the planning that went up into this attempted coup.
Yeah. Richard Bearden, 50 years. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I was about to say, I saw Congressman Scalise tweeted this morning, is Congress going to have a hearing on how inflation is at a 40-year high and you know what happened with the baby formula crisis. So again, I think the hearing is important. Is it a prime time? You know, this is going to change the midterm elections? Probably not. But I think in this environment we're in, very politically charged. If you're on the right, you think, gosh, terrible, but we got to move on. And if you're on the left, it's the most important thing out there. I think that just really says where the sort of polarization of our country is right now in terms of politics.
Yeah, some of us can remember a half century ago, it pains us to, half-century ago, there was a similar sort of hearing. And the gentleman who sat in Congress from South Arkansas, Mr. Thornton at the time, was on that panel. And it was profoundly bipartisan. There was a spirited opposition from within that side, from the Republican side of the Watergate Select Committee. Richard, you just mentioned polarization. A half century makes a lot of difference. Or it certainly has, as we're seeing.
It does, Steve. And I think to some degree you've got that 24-hour news cycle. There's constantly something to comment on. And I just think it drives, you know, my parents didn't watch Fox News. They're retired. They watch Fox News. Other folks didn't watch CNN all day. And that's what drives the story. And it's not really even news making as much as it is a political commentator being paid to sort of, you know, fire up an audience so they get good ratings. And I think that sort of has and is what drives a lot of public opinion these days. It's those snippets on national cable shows about what happened or didn't happen in their view.
In terms of Arkansas politics this year, one candidate in November in particular has strong ties to Mr. Trump, and of course that's Ms. Sanders, the Republican gubernatorial nominee. Do you see these hearings? We've only had, at this hour, we only had one night of them. Michael, do you see any impact at all on her race?
Oh, not at all. No. You know, I think these hearings will have an impact nationally. In Arkansas, it won't make a difference. We kind of see where the train is heading down the tracks on that race for governor. I don't think it makes one bit of difference to where Arkansas voters are, unfortunately, for Democrats and democracy in general, I believe, in my opinion. But no, it won't have any impact.
Richard Bearden, I can't imagine you disagree with that.
I can, and look, I would say this: if you watched Sarah Huckabee Sanders commercials, it was really just at the very end. There was a picture of she and President Trump walking, I think, in the colonnade there at the White House on the West Wing. she was going to win the Republican nomination. I think she's going to win this fall with high numbers, with or without President Trump's endorsement. I would also make the argument Senator Bozeman was in a closer than expected race. There was a lot to be made of his endorsement by President Trump, but I would make the argument that the endorsement of Senator Cotton and Sarah Huckabee Sanders made as much of a difference as Donald Trump's endorsement. And I say that because there were two other candidates that sort of inferred an endorsement by Donald Trump. One was Conrad Reynolds, who ran for the 2nd District Congress. The other was a candidate for Secretary of State, and both of them lost very handily. So I think Donald Trump here, even among Republicans, is somewhat of a mixed bag. And again, I could make the argument that Sarah Huckabee Sanders won of her own accord, and it's not going to make much of a difference this fall whether she is or isn't formally endorsed by Donald Trump.
Yeah. Where do you see, what's the temperature right now? Is after a first primary anyway in Arkansas, have things sort of settled down a little bit?
I think temporarily, yes. I mean, after a big primary, no matter who wins or loses, everybody just wants to, first of all, just take a break after these intense.
Unless you're in a runoff.
Yeah, unless you're in a runoff. You know, there are a few of those around the state. I think almost all Republican runoffs. The few that are, but I think having running campaigns for many years, at this point, campaigns are kind of for the ones that have the November elections, they're retooling what worked, what didn't work. Do we tweak our message? We got to raise money all over again. We got to get organized. So you have a lot of people behind the scenes working hard, trying to get their candidates elected again.
Yeah. Richard Bearden, you get the last word.
Well, I agree. I mean, it's a money game, and I think you'll see both all of the candidates out there trying to reload their campaign coffers. So it's a nonstop process. But again, I think it's going to be a big year for Republicans this year, and no really surprises this fall.
All right, gents, thanks for coming in as always. We'll see you back here again soon.
Thanks for having us.
And we'll be right back. We are back, and now to the matter of May turnout and the June follow-up to the November outlook and our comparatively low participation rate. A pair of veteran scholars of Arkansas politics with us now. From the Political Science Department at UCA, Dr. Heather Yates, and from the University at Fayetteville, Dr. Janine Perry. Doctors, thank you very much for being with us. Heather, let's begin with you, if we may. The May turnout, the primary turnout, surprised a lot of people for its vigor. We outperformed, I think, projections. Your thoughts on why, and can that carry forward into the June runoff?
So Arkansas numbers did exceed projection, and this exceeds the number of turnout of voters from 2010. And I think some context is important here because in 2010, that was also a year of vigor because of the Obama administration's healthcare reform that mobilized a lot of interest, and it mobilized a lot of voters in the midterm. So this time around, we have that increased vigor in 2022 for different reasons, but the context is still there. So we've got high-profile candidates in Arkansas. We have a race at the top of the ticket, a gubernatorial race, and we know from previous history of elections that anytime that there's a race at the top of the ticket, that does attract voters. We also have a unique context in which we are conducting this election. This is the first midterm, this election after the presidential race of 2020. And so there is a couple of factors. There's a couple of moods in the electorate. One is going to be a higher sense of threat perception. That is always going to mobilize voters to the polls. There's also, on the same emotional dimension here to discuss, is enthusiasm. Arkansas does have two historic gubernatorial candidates in the Democratic and the Republican columns. That is also going to generate the electoral turnout we saw. Comparatively moving forward into November, we are going to see maybe the same vigor. It's hard to tell, but we also do need to acknowledge that the electorate looks very different in a primary than the general election. The primary electorate is going to be the party base, the partisan loyalists, the rank and file. These are going to be the voters of high knowledge. They're paying attention to the races. In November, the general election electorate looks a little different. So we might have a little bit of a suppressed vote there. It'll remain to be seen, but we are in the general election cycle, and so there's going to be a lot of things happen between now and November that could affect mobilization.
Yeah, Janine Perry, were you surprised at all by the May turnout?
I wasn't. I knew from just glancing at 20 years of Arkansas turnout and then what we're able to gather from national averages, which is pretty rough since primaries are intra-party affairs and then they're at different times, right, across different states. But Arkansas has on average been lower than the national average, but it's varied tremendously. I mean, the lowest figure I found was 15% turnout in the primary of 2000. And the highest was 30% in 2016. So projections of between 20 and 23% for this one seemed pretty much on target. So us coming in at 26% of registered voters, was a little surprising. But we know in the national climate that we think of the states that have voted so far that turnout has been up maybe around 10% on average. That's not consistent across the states. In California, it was down. But I looked up a few, that were significantly up, like Arkansas, 4 or 5 points, which matters when turnout is this low. Iowa, Idaho, Texas, North Carolina were all up by several digits. So it seems to be part of a national pattern.
Yeah, I would know Georgia, too, really surprised a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mean, there are different dynamics happening in Georgia.
Sure.
Because you don't just want to look at overall turnout. You also want to look at turnout inside each of the primaries. And something I thought was quite interesting here, something I was looking ahead to getting the data about, was about the total turnout in the Democratic primary as compared to this year as compared to 2018. And the number of Democrats participating actually dropped this year compared to 2018. Whereas, so most of that increase, right, all that increase really was coming on the Republican side. And just to give that a little more context, raw numbers aren't always helpful to us, but about 2 out of every 3 voters in the primary of 2018 voted on the Republican side. This time, 8 out of 10 voted on the Republican side. I think there are a number of interesting reasons for that, but that was a very dramatic shift in a short period of time.
We have, speaking of the Republican side, well, particularly the Republican side, a number of legislative candidates in runoffs this month. And the challenge will, for both sides, but particularly the incumbent. Some are incumbents captured in runoffs. And the challenge is going to be to animate that base, motivate that base to get back out, both sides. Heather Yates?
Whenever we have a race where we've got especially a runoff, you've got incumbents, you've also got, not just in Arkansas, but in other states throughout the South and elsewhere, where incumbents are facing off because of gerrymandered districts. So whenever there is a runoff election, it is harder, like you said, to mobilize voters to then turn around 3 or 4 weeks later. In Arkansas, it's June 21st, so it's roughly about 30 days later. So that really is a heavy mantle on the campaigns, right, to then drum up more interest and mobilization, have people go out to the polls again to vote. It's increasingly more difficult, and it's a heavy lift on those campaigns.
Right. Janine Perry.
It certainly is. It's going to come down in some of those races, to probably literally dozens of votes because it's so hard to get people out. Again, like it's summer's in full swing, et cetera. So it's really about those loyalists. And I also would just say this looks a lot like what we have in recorded history about Arkansas for most of the 20th century, particularly at the middle part, where you would have 6, 7, 8, 9 candidates on the Democratic side, no candidates or one candidate on the Republican side. And so everything was an intra-party affair. And, general election turnout was low. And we look destined for that here to see that same thing in Arkansas, just in reverse. And that's not atypical. There are now, I think a record high, at least for contemporary history, of what we call trifectas in state government. So the state house, the state senate, and the governor are all Republican at this time. I mean, you go back to the early 90s, and that was only true of 3 states. It's now almost half the states. And together with gerrymandering and those other institutional mechanisms that Republicans have just been better at using, more sophisticated than Democrats were when they had more trifectas, That's just going to take this whole thing, I think, further into the future and make these intra-party contests the first time, and then into runoffs, really the main event in a lot of American states, including Arkansas.
Of course, the big statutory change in any election schematic, of course, is the decennial redistricting, which we've just had. But Arkansas, as you mentioned, as so many other states, has adjusted, let's put it that way, its laws governing voter registration and voter participation. What impact do you think, doctors, we're likely to see in the next, this year and in the foreseeable future, owing to what the General Assembly has done? Heather Yates, we'll begin with you.
So looking at the garden variety of legislation that was proposed and then subsequently passed, we see that a lot of the laws target the infrastructure surrounding election management. Not in Arkansas specifically, not so much making registration more difficult, because there's already a gatekeeping process that it makes registration difficult. For example, we don't have online registration. We have very limited outlets in which somebody can get registered. Putting that aside, the legislation that we are seeing focuses on mail-in ballots, absentee ballots. Last fall, a national report came out that ranked Arkansas 50 out of 50 on both registered voters, so voting eligible population. Secondly, Arkansas had the highest rate of rejection on absentee ballots. And so the state legislation focuses and targets that absentee ballot. It does so through making it easier to reject an absentee ballot. It also reduces the threshold of 10 ballots to 5 ballots in possession of a single person in order to identify an intent to commit voter fraud. That's a very different threshold. We've also got legislation that gives the state board in Arkansas control, or the ability to take control of county elections and management. So what that means in sum is that it's a consolidation of election management at the state level instead of the confederal operation of having county clerks being that autonomous election management agent. And that could actually have a very big impact going into November that we didn't see in May.
Janine Peer, I can see you nodding in agreement there, I think.
I am. I was also just going to follow up on what Dr. Yates said, which is we wouldn't expect most of those modest but additional obstacles to make much of a difference in primary elections, because as she pointed out earlier, those are not your garden variety voters. There's very little that's going to deter them from participating. But it's in general elections where decades of political science research looking at the tremendous variety among states in terms of who has many obstacles, who has few obstacles. We can look at the levers of when states reduce obstacles and increase obstacles. And we know that more obstacles reduces turnout in general elections, and it particularly reduces turnout among lower income, younger, lower levels, just sort of less established in their communities people. Who are the ones who kind of get drawn in and out of elections anyway. So if we do see an effect, it's likely that we'll see it actually in the general election. We won't be able to parse it out from the fact that Arkansas is, again, a one-party monopoly in the other direction, and that tends to dramatically depress general election turnout. We won't be able to tell what's causing what, but it'll play a part probably in low voter turnout in the general election relative to other states, as is Arkansas's long history.
Yeah, a couple of minutes remaining. Of course, you can't participate unless you're at the polls anyway, unless you're registered. And our registration rate has been fairly anemic over the decades. What is it going to take to juice that up? Or do you see anything? Is the jaundice out there so profound that we're not likely to move that needle? Janine Perry?
Well, it's just a long pattern. I mean, the two major predictors of participation, whether that's registration or then following through on registration, right, historically have been education and income. And Arkansas historically has been among the lowest states in both respects. So we really shouldn't expect anything different. You compound that with this prolonged, experience with one-party monopoly, which also tends to depress turnout, as I mentioned earlier. And I just don't think that there's much we can do other than to change the levers and make it easier, right, to reduce obstacles. We know from other states, again, that would increase voter turnout. But that doesn't really seem to be the direction that this legislature and this political climate is headed.
Yeah. Heather Yates, you get the last word.
And to build upon the points brought forward by Dr. Perry is there's also a lot of obstacles in rural areas. There's a rural versus urban or ex-urban divide here because the state of Arkansas has also technological issues with getting broadband out to the rural parts of Arkansas. And since Arkansas does not have online registration, getting rural voters and also the demographics, we know that 18 to 25-year-olds are notoriously the demographic that don't participate, don't mobilize, and hardest to get registered to vote. And so there's also a lot of talk in the state about expanding broadband access. And so there's some very practical technological aspects that present this barrier to voting. And I should also mention, I neglected to mention earlier, but the state legislature also reduced the window of early voting from 30 days to 3 weeks. And that will also, I think, have a more pronounced impact in November than it did May for all the aforementioned reasons we said earlier. But there's a real challenge at getting rural voters registered and access to polling sites.
Right. Wish we could go on, got to end it there because the clock is stopping us. Janine Perry and Heather Yates, thanks very much for being with us. Come back soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And that will do it for us for this week. As always, thanks for watching. See you next week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR FM 89.